It was on a tranquil, sun-drenched morning that the familiar peace of Havenwood was shattered. The sound began as a distant growl on the horizon, a low thrum that vibrated through the asphalt of the main street and rattled the windows of the old brick storefronts. The noise swelled into a deafening roar, a mechanical thunder that announced the arrival of the Iron Serpents. They rolled into the gravel lot of the lone roadside diner, a procession of chrome and black leather that seemed to absorb the gentle morning light. At their head was a man whose very presence seemed to command the air around him, Jackson Ryder, known to most only as Jax. His name was a low whisper in taverns and a cautionary tale in quiet homes, a name that echoed with the rumble of his custom motorcycle. He was a formidable figure, built with the rugged permanence of a mountain, his face a roadmap of hard miles and unspoken sorrows. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, held a depth that suggested he'd seen the best and worst of the world and had long since stopped being surprised by either. Legends were woven around him, tales of loyalty and ruthlessness in equal measure. He was feared by many, respected by some, but understood by none. The man behind the weathered leather and the intricate tattoos remained a mystery. If you hold the belief that compassion can blossom in the most hardened of souls, and that every person is worthy of a chance at redemption, then we invite you to support our community by liking, commenting, and subscribing to the Compassion Chronicle, where we share true accounts of humanity's better angels. Inside the diner, the cheerful clatter of cutlery and conversation dwindled to a hushed murmur as the bikers filed in, their heavy boots echoing on the linoleum floor. They chose a series of booths in the back, a silent, imposing force that shifted the diner's entire atmosphere. Moving through the tense quiet was a waitress named Clara. Her name tag was slightly crooked, a small imperfection that seemed to suit her. She was perhaps in her early 30s, with a fragile grace about her, but her eyes carried a profound weariness that went far beyond a lack of sleep. It was the exhaustion of a spirit under siege. As she approached Jax's table to pour coffee, her smile was a practiced, delicate thing that didn't quite reach her tired eyes. When she leaned over, the collar of her uniform shifted, and Jax saw it. Faint, but unmistakable beneath a hasty layer of foundation, was the ghost of a bruise, a yellowish-purple shadow just below her jaw. It was the kind of mark that told a story no one wanted to hear, a story he knew all too well. The sight of it was like a key turning in a long-locked room in his memory. It stirred the ghost of a past he had spent years trying to outrun, a past that still ambushed him in the dead of night when the roar of the engine faded and only silence remained. Clara worked with a quiet efficiency, her gaze fixed on the tabletops, the floor, anywhere but the faces of the men she served. Her hands, he noticed, had a slight, persistent tremor as she set a heavy ceramic plate down in front of him. Jax's intense gaze followed her, but it wasn't a look of aggression or judgment. It was one of deep, unsettling recognition. He didn't utter a word, but a storm was brewing within him, a cold fury mingling with a familiar, agonizing ache he hadn't allowed himself to feel for nearly a decade. In her palpable fear, he saw a reflection of a pain he was intimately acquainted with. Years ago, he had lost someone dear to him, a woman named Elena, to the very same silent violence, the kind that festers behind locked doors and polite smiles. He had failed to see the signs until it was too late, and that failure had become the bedrock of the fortress he'd built around his heart. That memory was a wound he'd buried under layers of grit, leather, and miles of open road. But now, watching this fragile waitress with her trembling hands and hidden bruises, the past was clawing its way back to the surface with a vengeance. Outside, the brilliant morning sky had begun to curdle, with gray clouds gathering on the horizon. The wind kicked up, sending dust and loose gravel skittering across the parking lot. The other Iron Serpents were laughing amongst themselves, their voices a low rumble that barely registered with Jax. His attention was entirely fixed on Clara. He watched her retreat toward the swinging doors of the kitchen, her shoulders slumped in a posture of defeat. He saw how she flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of her entire body, when a sharp, commanding voice barked her name from behind the counter. The voice belonged to the manager, a portly man named Henderson with a perpetually sour expression and small, cruel eyes that seemed to take pleasure in the discomfort of others. And in that single, sharp interaction, the vague unease in Jax's gut solidified into cold, hard certainty. Hours bled into one another. The lunch rush came and went, a flurry of activity that Clara navigated with the same strained composure. As the diner emptied out, Jax remained, nursing a now cold cup of coffee at the counter. He pretended to be absorbed in the local paper, but his focus was entirely on the grim theater playing out before him. He watched as Henderson strode past Clara, deliberately bumping her shoulder with enough force to make her slosh a pitcher of iced tea. A few drops splashed onto the floor. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Henderson," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she scrambled for a cloth. The manager's reply was a venomous hiss, too low for others to hear the words, but the malice in his tone was unmistakable. "Clumsy girl. Clean it up." Now Jax's jaw clenched so hard a muscle pulsed in his cheek. There was no longer any room for doubt. This wasn't the stress of a demanding job. This was a calculated campaign of cruelty. This was fear, the kind of suffocating fear that steals a person's voice and traps them in a cage of silence. He saw Elena's face superimposed over Clara's, and the old wound in his soul tore open anew. That night, the image of Clara's bruised face was burned into his mind. He sat alone in a cavernous garage that served as the Iron Serpents clubhouse, the hum of a neon sign casting an eerie blue glow over the rows of sleeping motorcycles. He was supposed to be tuning his engine, but his hands were still, the wrench lying forgotten on the concrete floor. His brothers filtered in, their laughter and boisterous stories filling the space, but Jax was a million miles away, lost in a labyrinth of memory and regret. He was back in another time, another place, remembering Elena's forced smiles and her long-sleeved shirts in the middle of summer. He remembered the excuses, the accidents, the signs he had been too young, too blind, too wrapped up in his own world to see. He had been given a chance to be her protector, and he had failed. He had sworn to himself, over her grave, that he would never again stand by and watch weakness be preyed upon. He had built the Iron Serpents on a code of loyalty, of protecting their own. But what was that code worth if it didn't extend to the truly defenseless? He picked up the wrench, his knuckles white. He had made a promise. This time, he would not fail. The following morning, the sun rose on a clear, determined sky. Clara arrived for her shift early, the knot of anxiety in her stomach already tightening. She had spent the night patching up her composure, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, a little extra concealer dabbed on her cheek where a new mark was beginning to bloom. As she pulled into the lot, her heart sank. The motorcycles were already there, a silent, gleaming phalanx parked in perfect formation. Their chrome glittered in the early morning sun, looking more like instruments of war than vehicles. Her breath caught in her throat. She found Jax sitting at the counter, exactly where she'd left him, a fresh cup of coffee in front of him. He looked as if he hadn't moved all night. As she approached with her notepad, steeling herself for another difficult day, he looked up. His gaze was direct, but devoid of the menace she expected. "Morning," he said, his voice a low, gravelly sound. He then asked a question that unmoored her completely. "Are you all right?" It was asked so softly, so genuinely, that it bypassed all her defenses. She gave a quick, jerky nod, the automatic response of someone used to hiding. "I'm fine, thank you," she managed, her practiced smile trembling at the edges. But as she turned to walk away, he spoke again, his voice gentle but firm, cutting through the diner's quiet hum. "You don't have to be," he said. Not anymore. He didn't pity her. He didn't judge her. He simply saw her, and in that moment of pure, unexpected validation, the dam she had so carefully constructed inside her shattered. Tears she hadn't even known were there welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks in hot, silent streams before she could even think to stop them. Just then, the kitchen doors swung open with a crash. Henderson emerged, his face red with anger. "Clara. What is the meaning of this? Crying on the job? Get back to," he stopped short. Jax had risen from his stool. He didn't move quickly, but with a deliberate grace that was far more intimidating than any sudden motion. The entire room fell into a profound silence. Behind him, every member of the Iron Serpent straightened up, their collective presence a solid wall of leather and muscle. Henderson's blustering tone faltered, his arrogance shriveling under the weight of a dozen pairs of unblinking eyes. Jax walked toward him, his boots making a slow, rhythmic sound on the floor. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Making someone who can't fight back feel small doesn't make you a big man, Jax said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. It just makes you pathetic. Henderson sputtered, trying to regain his footing. This is my business. I'll call the police. You can't. His words died in his throat as he took in the sight of the men standing behind Jax, their expressions ranging from cold indifference to outright contempt. He saw in their faces that they would not be moved by threats or authority. Defeated, he let out a string of curses under his breath, turned on his heel, and stormed out, the diner door swinging shut behind him with a final, pathetic slam. For a long, breathless moment, nobody moved. The silence was thick with unspoken emotion. Then, Clara turned to Jax, her face streaked with tears but her eyes shining with a light he hadn't seen before. "Thank you," she whispered, the words so faint they were almost carried away by the air. Jax simply gave a slow, deliberate nod. "You don't have to thank anyone," he replied, his voice softening. "You just have to start over." Without being afraid, the diner, which had been frozen in silent observation, slowly came back to life. A quiet murmur spread through the room. Patrons who had averted their eyes earlier now looked on with a mixture of awe and shame for their own inaction. An elderly man at a corner table stood up and began to clap, a soft, hesitant sound. Then another person joined in, and another, until the small diner was filled with a steady, heartfelt applause that sounded like a collective heartbeat. By nightfall, the story of what happened at the diner had woven its way into the very fabric of Havenwood. The Iron Serpents, the men who had once been regarded with fear and suspicion, were suddenly viewed in a new light. They weren't just outlaws, they were guardians. The perception of them softened, transformed from a symbol of menace to one of unlikely heroism. Clara quit her job that same day. With a little help from some of the townsfolk who now saw her clearly for the first time, she found a new position at a bright, cheerful cafe across town, a place where the owner treated her with the kindness and respect she deserved. Every so often, Jax and his crew would stop by for coffee. He never acted like a savior. He was just a friend, checking in with a quiet nod, his presence a silent promise that she would never be alone again. And each time she saw him, her smile was genuine, a brilliant light that finally reached her eyes. But perhaps the most profound change was not in Clara or the town, but in Jax himself. For years, he had been living in a prison of his own making, its walls built from guilt and the ghost of a past failure. In helping Clara, he hadn't just broken her chains, he had shattered his own. It was a stark reminder that even a heart armored in leather and steel could still be a vessel for healing. His brothers saw the shift in him. The quiet fury that had always simmered beneath his surface was replaced by a sense of purpose. Inspired by his lead, the Iron Serpents began to change. They started organizing charity rides to raise money for women's shelters, held food drives for the local pantry, and volunteered for community projects. What began as one man's act of courage rippled outward, becoming a movement that fundamentally altered the soul of a motorcycle club and the town that had once feared it. One evening, months later, as a fiery sunset painted the sky over Havenwood, Clara stood outside the diner, now under new, kinder management. She heard the familiar thunder in the distance and watched as the line of motorcycles rumbled past. As he rode by, Jax caught her eye and raised a hand from his handlebars, a simple, quiet acknowledgement. It was a salute between two survivors, a bond forged not in words, but in a shared understanding of pain and resilience. She smiled, a deep and peaceful feeling settling in her heart. She knew then that sometimes, the kindest hearts don't whisper. They come roaring in on two wheels, clad in leather, bearing the scars of their own battles, ready to fight for someone else's. If this story resonated with you and reminded you that true strength is measured by our compassion, please consider showing your support by liking, sharing, and subscribing to the Compassion Chronicle. We are dedicated to celebrating the extraordinary goodness that quietly exists all around us. Before you leave, share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe that even the most formidable people can possess the most tender hearts? As the last sliver of sun disappeared behind the mountains, the town of Havenwood settled into a peaceful night, forever changed by the day the silence was broken, not by the roar of engines, but by the powerful, unwavering voice of kindness.